Well, it's been about a minute since I've gone and uploaded a video, so I figured it's time for me to come back, get right back in front of the camera, and do something a little bit different. Well, usually people are used to me doing pop culture critiques that are usually kind of witty, a little bit funny, and slightly enjoyable to watch. Instead, I figured we're going to do something a little bit different. Recently, during my hiatus from YouTube, I was arguing with a lot of TRAs, also known as trans rights activists, also known as delusional nutjobs who can't string together two logical lines of thought. I've been in several arguments with these people, and I've been watching a lot of the YouTuber King Critical, who is one of the most prevalent gender-critical YouTubers. So I figured, screw it, I don't feel like covering news today anyway, the news isn't really popping anyway, so we're actually going to go through and look at two of the arguments I've had with TRAs over the last couple of weeks, and just go and show you that pro-trans people do not have an argument. There is no argument that exists that is in defense of transgenderism that is neither fallacious nor easily refuted. All of the arguments are one of the two or both at the same time, using things like circular definitions, ad hominem attacks, and anything else you can think of under the sun to avoid answering the actual questions being asked. There are a few tricks that TRAs will always employ when they're faced with arguing. My favorite one, of course, is the straw man, where they just misrepresent you and go, well, you say that you need XYZ criteria for somebody to be a woman. Well, what about black women who didn't used to count, according to some people? Even though that is a misrepresentation of what everybody says. Anytime a trans person says that my definition of woman excludes real women, biological women, they're lying, and they're misrepresenting whatever it is I happen to have said. Then, of course, some of the other ad hominems that I love are just the term transphobe. That in and of itself is an ad hominem. Another one is when they conflate me with being a TERF, which is also an ad hominem designed to dissuade my argument purely based on the fact that I'm hateful and exclusionary. But the problem with calling me a TERF is I'm not a feminist. I haven't been a feminist for years, so I can't be a TERF. They also like to throw out things like, oh, well, you're just secretly attracted to transgender people, or you're just jealous of how pretty they look, or you couldn't possibly know their experiences, which is a funny thing to say because it also requires ignoring and dissuading and waving away the lived experiences of every person you're talking to. By assuming that they're all homogenous thinkers, you're proving yourself to be just as bigoted as you're accusing your opponent as being. Then, of course, there's the easy one, the circular definition. When you ask a trans person to define what is a woman, which, is kind of lazy questioning, even though it does get to the ontological roots of the problem here, is they will usually use a circular definition. A woman is somebody who identifies as a woman, and of course, I don't need to go and give you a dissertation on why that's improper logic. That horse has been thoroughly beaten. Now, there's one argument from TRAs that I get a lot, which is probably my favorite one I've ever seen, and it's all to do with what my profile picture is on Instagram. On my private Instagram, this is my profile picture. Wonder Woman, face palming, Ollie, I can't even with you. And it's not because I like Wonder Woman. I don't care about Wonder Woman one way or the other. I mean, I thought she was kind of cool in the Injustice timeline, but I'm not a huge Wonder Woman fan. And in reality, the only reason that's there is I really like Green Arrow. And I think it's a really funny still anyway, with great, I think the line is fantastic. And the comment I get beyond all other ones, and I get this almost any time I argue with TRAs online, is Wonder Woman would hate you. And I think it's one of the most laughable things anybody has ever said to me. As though I care what Wonder Woman or any fictional character has to say about my political or personal or lived experiences. It's their number one bomb, their favorite thing to throw out there, as though it ruins my argument. Because Wonder Woman's my profile picture, I must revere her, the same way that leftists revere other characters. I'm sure you've seen it, Sonic's a black man and Shadow loves trans women. It's a common line from leftists to post things like that without, any reason to back it up in the lore, only because it's their comfort character, and they have to kin them as some bleeding heart liberal, or else they're gonna cry. And that's usually how, and I know I'm poisoning the well a bit, but that's usually how liberals like to frame these characters. They associate with fictional characters to guide their life on how to live. Me, however, I don't really care about Wonder Woman, it's just a funny image, and I like the image, and that's it. Also, the other problem with that argumentation, the claim that Wonder Woman would hate me for my beliefs, is laughable at best. If Wonder Woman was a well-written character, because let's be honest, most comics are very poorly written, Wonder Woman would hate trans people because they are not women. Wonder Woman is a xenophobe and a gender extremist. She believes in matriarchy. She believes women are ultimately and utterly superior to men, and therefore no man could become a woman because then he is appropriating a woman's power. Similarly, Wonder Woman values truth and justice, and claiming to be something you are not is a violation of that maxim. Any, and I mean any comic where Wonder Woman or Themysciran's affirmed trans identity is a poorly written comic because it violates the core of the characters. And because I'm sure some leftists are going to click on this, I'm going to make some things very clear. One, I am bisexual. I'm very bisexual, and I'm fully integrated into the LGB, not the T. Two, during my youthful years, I had suffered from a mild amount of gender dysphoria. I know what that's like, and I know what it's like to question whether or not you were born in the right body, to wonder what everything else is. And you know what the answer is? You just wait it out. Because when you grow up, when you go through puberty, the dysphoria goes away in 96% of cases, and that is refutable in studies. Studies have shown this to be true, that most cases of gender dysphoria desist naturally, especially as you grow into your actual body. So before somebody uses identitary waving away, you can't, because I refute you. I lived the experiences you claim you must live to experience this. And finally, let's be very clear, up until about 5 years ago, I was fully on board with promoting and accepting gender identity as though it was something that was real. And now I've realized I was a fool and I was listening to leftist empathy-based politics. Empathy, as in toxic empathy, not real empathy. It's not valid. So before going further, I know this was an incredibly long preamble, but let's actually get into some of the argument that was being had. Now, I'm not going to go over the whole thing because one of the threads is 91 messages long, and these were arguments on Instagram specifically, where a lot of times I'll see a post and I'll just comment, "You're an idiot, yada yada, here's the reason." I saw somebody make the oak seed example for abortion. I had to argue that. Just small things, usually trying to be funny while also instigating these people who cannot argue to argue. Now, like I said, the first argument is 51,000 characters long, so I'm just going to pick out a couple of my favorite highlights. For instance, where I refer to it as a social contagion, like transgenderism, literally, yes, encouraging is grooming, is what I said. And then they responded with, "Oh wait, you're a TERF and therefore a moron." Never mind. To which I had to kindly remind them that being trans non-accepting, is not being a TERF. Because to be a TERF, you must still be a radical feminist. And oh babe, I'm not even a feminist. And no, not a moron, but solidly rooted in science and fact and concern for the well-being of my fellow gays. Because let's be clear, and this is an argument I'll make later, transgenderism as an ideology is an anti-gay ideology. And then the first thing they do, which a lot of TRAs are going to do, is they try to play semantics. When I called it an ideology, they responded with social contagion, transgenderism, it's not an ideology, LMAO, you actually gotta stop smoking the crack pipe, dude. And this is really where they made the first step. While trying to correct me on terminology, they make a crucial slip by implying that in order for something to be a social contagion, it must first be an ideology. They basically conflate ideology and social contagion, and then they say transgenderism is not an ideology. All three of those are false statements, which I then go on to prove, and they ignore. Where I call them out for saying, firstly, that transgenderism isn't a social contagion, then in that order from something to be a social contagion, it must be an ideology, and that transgenderism isn't an ideology. Three claims all wrong, because transgenderism is an ideology as defined by the definition of ideology, and we'll get into definitions in a little bit. Now, when they failed to comprehend what I was trying to say, I had to elaborate. Transness is a social contagion because it is based on a delusion that will cause excessive and undue harm to the person who partakes in it, and it spreads within groups. When one person comes out as trans, many more within the group will too. An engagement in pro-trans sentiment will often lead to someone developing transgender ideation, such as most TRAs eventually becoming trans, and this can be seen through most TRA philosophy channels, such as PhilosophyTube and other ones similar to that, where shortly after they start their channel, they eventually start their transitioning exploration down into the rabbit hole. Secondly, transgenderism is an ideology and not an identity, firstly because you do not get to choose your identity. I am as tall as I am, the sex I am, with the eye color I have, my identity is what I am, not who I want to be. Definitionally, ideology is a systemic body of concepts, especially about human life or culture. The claim that gender is a social construct is that you can change your gender, and that there are an infinite number of genders are a claim about the world and society. Ergo, it is an ideology. That definition one-to-one matches up with the claim that transgenderism isn't an ideology. So, sorry, but that was another point where they're wrong, and they love to play these semantic little games because it means that they can try and weasel in free wins. That's when somebody tries to play semantics, you have to call them out. The core way to beat a TRA in an argument is to simply find out what they're saying and call them out for being, well, dipshits. They're lying to you. They're being disingenuous, and when you call them out for it, they tend to have to recoil back into their little caves and find another way to attack, which is when they usually bring out the ad hominems, which you must then also attack. Now, at one point in time, this person decides to get into the semantics of harm. I said that transitioning comes with undue and excessive harm. This person says, what harm does it do? And I simply said, I didn't think I'd have to say it because it's self-evident. But for those who don't know, when you transition, you become infertile. It's permanent, not reversible. You cannot reverse hormone therapy. Once it starts having an effect on your body, it's permanent. And hormone blockers are similar. So they cause infertility, calcification of reproductive organs, which increases the risk of cancer. It causes bone density problems. It causes muscle and joint damage. And once you're on them, it's not like you can stop because your body can no longer produce hormones on your own, so you are now a medical patient for life. Those are just some of the ways that it is harmful, and, well, I thought we were all on board about that, because it's, well, logical and common sense that to be true. So they responded, self-evident, if only your arguments could make themselves for you. Increased suicidality isn't even a medical term, and you'd be wrong either way. Self-harm, again, is not a product of transness. You continue to conveniently neglect details like the fact that trans people are often shunned or disowned by family members, excluded from their communities, and even targeted by hate campaigns and individual disfigurement. Violence for merely existing. This further supported by the fact that suicidal ideation and self-harm are radically less likely in trans people who have support systems and accepting loved ones. Permanent disfigurement is laughable hyperbole for transition. You'll have to elaborate on the cognitive dissonance. You seem to not know what that phrase means. No, subscribing to your beliefs is not prerequisite for having a good faith discussion. Moving on. You'll also need to back up your claim that trans has skyrocketed during this unspecified time period. I'm not sure how you can claim my position isn't in good faith and then turn around and say being comfortable in your body as opposed to most ideologies. LOL. That's a stretch. If I've ever seen one. You're being deliberately obtuse. Obviously, nobody is here trying to completely get rid of discomfort. Hedonism is a whole other topic. You're all over the place here. Correctly defining gender is not ideological. You can take it up with English language if it bothers you. You can write off anything that disagrees with your worldview as unscientific, but the irony isn't wasted on me. You have disproved nothing except your own ignorance, so I've proven I'm not ignorant. Thanks, I guess. You seem to be failing at even quoting a statement of mine, in that the quote I'm saying socially contagion is ideology. I'm just disagreeing with that transgenderism is an ideology. It's very telling that you'd rather die on this hill than engage with what I'm actually saying. You may choose to keep asserting a claim on my behalf that I have no interest in supporting because I don't subscribe to it. Now, that was a word salad. I went through it fast and I made some verbal mistakes. My apologies. But there are a lot of issues in here. Me saying that something is self-evident is not saying that I assume you know how the world works. Me saying it's self-evident is it's based in reality. It's not my belief that transitioning is harmful. It's that it is harmful and that the harmful effects are well known. You have to deliberately ignore the harm in order for you to pretend it doesn't exist, when it thoroughly and objectively does. Now, they do some fun things like improperly referencing some studies, talking about how people will only find reduction in suicidality if they are shown acceptance and kindness. Problem is, those studies that show that are generally pretty flawed. The ones that focus on acceptance as being the end-all be-all for getting rid of suicidal ideation tend to ignore things like survivorship bias. They tend to fully go in on that instead of relying on the notion that maybe you should follow the people who kill themselves. They also make the claims such as transgender individuals experience violence for merely existing, which is not true. If you want to see how those studies break down, divide it by race, and all of a sudden the increased violence disappears overnight. It's not an issue of cis attacking trans people, it's more an issue of certain demographics being unjustly targeted by trans people and then responding like they're predisposed to. Similarly, the line, you have to back up your claim that trans has skyrocketed during this unspecified time period, is, I'd say, self-evident, but apparently this person is too low intellect to use Google. We know for a fact that transgender ideation has skyrocketed in the last few years, going up from about 1% of all people to, I think it was 7 to 10% in Gen Z. An extremely large jump that does not make sense when you account for how normal people behave. And to clarify where hedonism came into this, I did say that affirming gender ideology is a hedonistic act. It is affirming a temporary discomfort at the cost of lifelong dissatisfaction. By allowing somebody to chop up their body and mutilate it with hormones and whatnot, you are actively causing long-term and permanent harm to this person to alleviate short-term discomfort usually brought on by puberty that goes away as puberty ends. It is hedonistic at best to cut off your nose to spite your face. And of course, this person doesn't bother to try to refute it. And this is a common thing. The reason I'm pulling up this argument specifically is because at one point in time, the argument becomes make a single valid claim, and the person utterly failing to do so, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. My favorite line about this is when they say that increased suicidality isn't even a medical term. When it is. It objectively is. It is a very common medical term that is very frequently used to discuss suicidal ideation within the trans community. That's where a lot of this term is used. They also make a couple of pretty severe strawman attacks, such as saying that I claimed that people self-harm because they're trans. I never once said that. Claiming that mental illnesses arise because someone is trans. I never made that claim either. And they, throughout this argument, make a lot of these strawman attacks, which is very common. For those who don't know, a strawman is when you reconstruct somebody else's argument, but deliberately misrepresents it to make it easier to tear down. For instance, if I say that trans people have a significantly higher rate of self-harm, and you respond with, so you're saying being trans makes you self-harm. I did not say that. Although that statement is true because being trans, if you transition, you are harming yourself through puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and, of course, mutilation. And to be clear, it took them about 10 interactions to admit that suicidality is a real term. It took forever for them to concede the one area where they made an objective mistake, one that can't be wigged away through rhetoric or ideology, but one where they legitimately screwed up. They refuse to concede on that because a lot of these people think if they concede on the small things, it must mean they're conceding on the bigger things. At one point, I made the claim that transgenderism is a symptom of mental illness. To be clear, I don't think transgenderism is the mental illness. I think it is a symptom. It is a symptom of anxiety, depression, puberty, which is not a mental illness, but can cause mental illnesses to temporarily take form when you're a giant hormonal stew. PTSD, OCD, a million other disorders can all cause transgender ideation. It's not tied directly to gender dysphoria, and gender dysphoria itself is usually a symptom of something else. And their response is just beautiful because it shows just how good faith they're willing to be. Transgenderism is a symptom of mental illness. Which mental illness is trans listed as a symptom of? You're making shit up at this point. You try to come off as intellectual, but your arguments could be found among even the dullest PragerU fanatic. You're not qualified to deem someone else's medical procedures as unnecessary. Cis people also use HRT. You seem to believe it's something only trans people get. And no, healthcare isn't self-harm. The problem with these claims is how subjective they are, and that it's bound to happen when your views go against scientific census. One, there's no empirical data to suggest that teaching about suicide increases anyone's odds of committing it. And two, time and time again, research has shown that trans people are far less likely to commit suicide or sold harm with support systems. Three, again, you are wrong. I can't in good faith debate someone who outright denies the existence of hate crimes. You're clearly beyond reason and fact. Now, real quick, just how many of those arguments do you think I actually made? Spoiler alert, it's 0. They also reference 2 different kinds of studies that we both know to be false. The first one is there's no empirical data to suggest that teaching about suicide increases anyone's odds of committing it is a false claim. That is untrue. We know if people are not exposed to these ideas, such as suicidal ideation, their odds of committing suicide is significantly lower. And as you teach somebody, tell somebody, and even warning somebody not to kill themselves will increase their odds of doing so. And well, because I'm not using a database to look for it, here's the only article I can find about it that references this belief, and this one specifically says that they find a reduction. Problem is, they also mention in this abstract that the ethics board does not really allow for studies into this field, because if there is a chance that talking about suicide can increase somebody's likelihood to commit it, then it is no longer ethical to discuss it in any way, shape, or form, and therefore the studies can't actually be performed. But for instance, we do know that when people talk about suicide, say on social media and in personal discussions, that does increase the likelihood that somebody will then commit suicide because they're hearing about the idea through those sources. Their next claim is, time and time again, research has shown that trans people are far less likely to commit suicide or self-harm with a support system. And while sure, there might be studies that say this, they don't really show a very big picture. The actual only way to reduce long-term suicidal ideation in trans people, or more accurately, people in general, is pretty simple. You have to give them talk therapy. You have to talk through the problems and solve the problem at the center. Studies done in the UK recently found that affirming care has no reduction in suicidality. They found that not treating it had an increase. That they found that only affirmation with no talk therapy increased it. The only thing that decreased suicide ideation was talk therapy. And then, of course, the third point where they said, again, you are wrong, I can't in good faith debate someone who outright denies the existence of hate crimes. You're clearly beyond reason and fact. I never once denied the existence of hate crimes, another straw man. And like I said, they like to make those a lot. What I did say in that argument was most hate crimes are committed against are perpetrated against those who are the victims. That is sociologically shown to be a known trend that happens. And here I get them to concede suicidality as a term only in that I had to literally reference Google's Leo AI or whatever it's called, quoting the APA. It's taking a single APA definition for them to accept that a term that is relatively widely used is in fact a real term. Alright, because this is taking longer than expected, I do want to skip ahead a little bit to where I made one of my core claims. That there is no argument that you can make that defends transitioning that is not either fallacious or easily refuted. That's all I said. And so I asked them to make an argument. And their response was, well, there are no anti-trans arguments that are not fallacious or easily refuted. So, of course, I had to disprove that terrible notion. So I give them a handful of ones, and they are pretty simple. These are arguments to prove that transgenderism is not an acceptable ideology without it being... And these arguments are not fallacious, and they are kind of difficult to refute unless you just plug your ears and kick your feet. The first one, transgenderism is inherently homophobic, and if we will have to sacrifice one group to affirm the other. Another, the extreme comorbidity of mental illness with transgenderism points to a larger epistemic problem in the mind than just gender dysphoria. Affirming gender dysphoria is a problematic habit as affirmation prevents the engagement with counters and views opposition as cruel, not healthy. If you believe gender is a spectrum, then you do not need surgery. The very nature of transgenderism is inherently sexist by demanding you appeal to stereotypes as opposed to lived experiences. Studies in desisting show that those with gender dysphoria have a high rate of desisting within 4 years. When combined with studies that account for survivorship bias show that affirmed and transitioning children are more likely to kill themselves than non-affirmed and those who desist. And because this person did not understand what I was doing here, let me explain to you guys, the viewers. The core goal of this was to simply point out that in rhetoric, so I'm not referencing too much science, I'm not having to pull out studies out the wazoo, I'm purely making rhetorical, logical arguments, Socratic arguments to set up the basis for a wider argument. These are not theses, these are claims that can be substantiated later. That is the purpose, just to make a claim that I can turn into a formal argument. And I actually explain that when I say, and to be clear, I'm not asking you to refute those claims, I'm asking you to make an argument you believe is neither fallacious or easy to refute. You are more than welcome to try to refute them, but I'm far more interested in seeing you attempt to make even one pro-trans argument. And their response is beautiful. I just love that. I want to frame this on my wall. Their response to me making those 5 or 6 anti-trans arguments and asking them to make one pro-trans argument is really funny. I reject the very framing that one must defend and make a stance for marginalized group to justify their existence before that conversation can even begin. Replace trans in your comment with literally any other group, homosexuals for example, it sounds very totalitarian. Which is a hilarious cop-out. I'm not going to engage in the argument, I'm not going to engage in the debate because it's wrong and it's rude to make these kind of arguments about identity. I could never do that. Well, why not? If you have a stance you cannot defend, you have no right to have that belief. And therefore, to prove this, I simply just... Okay, homosexual people deserve to exist because it is a natural way for humanity to avoid overpopulation. In species where mates are one and distributed is unfair, where the top man often has multiple wives, leaving men without partners, evolving the ability to form socio-romantic bonds with the same sex prevents jealousy and fighting. There is purely rhetoric-based claim in defense of homosexuality. I can make one against it too. Homosexuality is wrong because it is behavior feeding off of carnal hedonism instead of actual romantic fulfillment. It overvalues friendship and aims at short-term lustful conquest instead of prioritizing long-term romantic and sexual satisfaction. Your refusal is a lie. If it is not that you reject the claim, it is that you are incapable of making an argument. Also, it's not an argument as to whether or not they should exist, but an argument as to whether or not their behavior is appropriate. It's not a question as to whether or not trans people should exist. It is, are trans people correct in their personal assessment and should they be transitioned? Now make an argument or admit that you can't. And that was my response to them. Both of which are perfectly sound arguments, perfectly based in logic, rhetoric, and reason. I don't need scientific studies or facts to prove my stances because I can articulate why I believe them. And all I'm asking, all I want is for them to articulate why they believe what they do. And I just love their response. The way in which you go about justifying homosexuality by virtue of utility is genuinely so disgusting and weird. Homosexual people deserve to exist because they're no different from heterosexual people. And for trans people, what do you mean by their behavior? As if they're just some monolith? Actually so idiotic. The little word games you keep playing in place of making any points is so boring. Please get some new material. Now, maybe it's because I'm a biased individual and I have this argument. But I'm pretty sure I just made like 7 different points. I made 5 or so points against transgenderism. I made 1 point in favor of homosexuality, and I made 1 point against homosexuality. That sounds like points to me, and not semantic war games. Feel free to correct me in the comments if you disagree. And, well, of course I'm going to justify homosexuality by virtue of utility. What else am I going to justify it in? Saying that people have the right to marry other men is not an actual argument. It requires asking questions like, what is a right? What is marriage? It requires pulling a Jordan B. Peterson and saying, what do you mean by that? And that's not a way that I feel like arguing. When I'm going to defend a position, I have to defend it with logic and reason, and you do as well. If you have a stance you want to defend, you must explain your stance in a way that makes sense to other people. And then this person, instead of actually listening, then waves away my stances as nothing more than hateful rhetoric and repositioning them as straw men. And for trans people, what do you mean by that? Their behavior, as if they're some monolith. Where did I claim that trans people are a monolith? Blair White and Lily Tino are not the same person, and nowhere did I claim that they were. And as I say to them, word games, you mean presenting arguments? Your ignorance is not a defense. You cannot claim I've presented no arguments when I presented many. Now make an argument, present your own argument. I have played no word games, no deception or trickery. Make an argument or admit you cannot. When discussing when, I do not acknowledge your ad hominem. Make an argument, you ask for a pro-argument, and I give you one. Now make your own pro-argument. Also, I never said transvestites are a monolith. It's all you have are pathetic buzzwords, a little script instead of a brain. Now here's where they go and play a little bit more of semantic trickery, which like I said is one of their favorite tools. Let's be so real, LMAO, your random accusations and claims aren't arguments. You need to back them up. Undeserving of the air you breathe looks like I struck a nerve. Despite your ego, you're just a tiny grain of sand in an endless desert. And I am a colossal golden sphinx gracing you with my presence. That was a real thing they typed to me. And I had to avoid dying of an aneurysm as I laughed because of how utterly narcissistic and self-absorbed of a claim that is. I want to repeat this. You are a tiny grain of sand in an endless desert, and I am a colossal golden sphinx gracing you with my presence. And then they follow with the awesome Wonder Woman is pro-trans icon, and she'd hate you, sweetie. Now, of course, there's the issue in that an argument can be a claim. I don't need to establish all the reasons why I have the claim. That is my argument. My argument is that the claim exists, and here are the claims. I don't have to substantiate them, because that's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing the validity of my claims, I'm arguing that those claims exist, now make your own claim. They're playing semantic word games again to try and avoid having to answer me. So I come back with, gracing me with your presence, a colossal golden sphinx, holy delusions of grandeur, Batman. It makes a lot more sense now why you can't make arguments. You cannot accept them. It's because you're completely delusional, like not even a little bit, but fully on. Is it BP or BPD? I'm certain it's one of the two though. Anyway, how's your dad? I always love when people bring up my profile picture as though I care. This is my profile picture because it's bullying Green Arrow, not because it's Wonder Woman. I don't care about Wonder Woman the slightest. But no, Wonder Woman is pro-woman and a sexist isolationist. If she was well written, which she isn't, she'd absolutely be a TERF. And I do mean TERF in that sense. She would be a trans exclusionary radical feminist, because that is who Wonder Woman has always acted as. And then it goes into a long list of arguing about who has delusions of grandeur. Is it me or is it the person who called themselves the Golden Sphinx? I'll let you guys decide which one that was. They then follow by claiming it's the way you prop yourself up as some arbiter of truth while making the most inane claims and demanding I debate you within that absurd framing dictated by you. It's a circus. Okay, so I have not propped myself as an arbiter of anything, especially not truth. I am definitely not an arbiter of truth. I get a lot of things wrong. I probably said a lot of things wrong in this one debate. Now, they call this framing absurd framing dictated by me. No, it's standard framing dictated by how rhetoric exchanges work. I asked, make a claim that is not easily refuted and based in rhetoric, not fallacy. And they say that's ridiculous. It's absurd. To have to substantiate my beliefs? I have to do that? Oh, God, no. That's so ridiculous. No, that's the bare minimum. They brought up burden of proof earlier, and while my burden of proof might be to apply facts or whatever, your burden of proof is to apply your beliefs in a way that I can hear them diffuse them, and then respond to them. At no point do they actually present anything to me whatsoever. So I responded, I have made at least 10 good faith arguments and a sum total of 0 bad faith ones. There has not been a single argument I have made that was not a good faith argument. Now make a single argument that is not easily refuted or rooted in fallacy. Once again, it's not about whether or not they have a right to exist. It is an argument as to whether or not it is correct to transition, and that it is a philosophical debate which you have made no attempt to defend. Now make a philosophical argument in defense of transitioning, or admit you have nothing. Stop circle jerking your high horse and say literally anything of value. She then responds, I mean, you're allowed to think that, but to me, you just made a bunch of wild and outlandish claims like transgenderism is sexist and homophobic, and then you were too lazy to back them up. So I mean, pat yourself on the back about it, I guess. If the argument is whether or not it is correct to transition, the simple answer is it's nobody's business except for those considering transitioning. So I guess that's my philosophy. I don't need to make philosophical arguments in favor of people transitioning, because at the end of the day, it's not my decision and doesn't impact me. It's like asking me to make a philosophical argument to justify someone's hairstyle, and equally pointless. And then of course they fall into a classic stumble, where they make the claim that it's none of my business. The libertarian-esque argument in favor of transgenderism, which unfortunately isn't really an argument, but a slippery slope. It is wild and outlandish because you are incapable of thinking at a deeper level. These are not wild or outlandish, but philosophically sound and quite easily. I did not back them up because that was not the point. The point was simple. I can make several claims which are sound and hard to refute. I expect you to do the same. My point was not to debate those claims, but to present them and to prove that there is philosophical backing against transgenderism, and then I asked you to prove philosophical defense of transgenderism. I never intended to substantiate because that's not the point. It's nobody's business except those considering transitioning, finally, something resembling an argument, but it fails the not easily refuted clause because that is an incredibly invalid claim that permits children getting tattoos, doing drugs, amputating healthy body parts, and, well, consuming CP. Your people can do what they want argument is not a good one, so is that the best you can do? You have something more substantial. I don't need to make a philosophical argument because it doesn't affect me, another terrible argument. By that logic, you can never speak bad about anything unless it impacts you. Theft, murder, rape, CP, all is permissible so long as it doesn't impact you. I'm not saying those things are equal in severity to transitioning, just that your logic is deeply flawed. And, of course, this is where they lose their mind and get quite ridiculous. If the argument for your position are so sound and easy to make, you would have made them. I did. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Easy. That's an invalid claim is another claim, not reasoning for one. You seem so utterly confused. You also immediately have to jump on extremes like CP, which is my favorite part, which is already illegal, so not sure where that's coming from. If it doesn't have anything to do with freedom of expression, which trans falls under. If you generally can't fathom why I wouldn't care about someone's harmless self-expression, but would care about violating crime like murder and rape, you're actually mentally bankrupt. A wet match in the dark cave. You just don't talk like a human being, completely lacking the ability to discern different context from one another. Yeah, rhetoric is important, making it all the more confusing why you fail to utilize it so frequently. What's most embarrassing is they seem to think they're saying the right things. They seem to think that logic is on their side, and they seem to think they're winning. So I respond with, they are not being asserted without evidence, they are being presented without. Do you see the difference? You are hopping through a million semantic hoops to avoid doing one small task, one very simple, one all because you are either incapable or too afraid. When the request was present a single argument in favor of transes, you said, there are no arguments against transes. Then I said, here are 6 anti-trans arguments which can be expanded upon and substantiated later. You said, it's wrong to make arguments about identity, so I said, here is an argument for and against homosexuality. So when I proved you wrong, you said those weren't arguments because you didn't substantiate. When it was made abundantly clear substantiation was not relevant to the matter at the time. Yes, this is an invalid claim, is a claim without evidence. That is why the very next sentence of my comment was evidence for why you are wrong. And yes, I did jump to extremes like CP to prove a point. It shows how severely broken your argument is because it opens the door for large slippery slopes. What does CP being illegal have to do with this? Oh wait, do you think morality is ordained by law? If so, CP was legal, would it be moral? I'm not trying to misrepresent you, I'm legitimately asking. Transitioning is a lot more than self-expression. If it was all about self-expression, it wouldn't need surgeries or hormonal influence. And according to some maps is a sexuality, so who's to say that's not expression itself? Kink is a form of self-expression, is it not? What if your kink happened to involve looking at minors? Do you see the issue here? You shift the goalpost and pigeonhole because you are too afraid to actually engage with substance. I've utilized rhetoric. Your ignorance and inability to recognize it does not make it absent. And they continue to be obtuse, okay? First you say you didn't bother backing up your claims because it was not the point, and now you're saying you actually did make arguments for position. Those are not contradictory statements. My claim and my argument was that here are arguments. Here are claims that can be made to substantiate my claim, and if I need to, I can refute If need, I can substantiate these specific claims at a later time, but the point is that their existence is what matters, not whether or not they are factual. And then they accuse me of playing semantic games. They also responded, no, I don't believe law dictates morality. I just think it's pointless to debate something that is already widely seen as immoral and is already illegal nationwide. I don't think it's necessary to explain the obvious difference between violent crime versus non-violent self-expression. Like, I'm sorry, but I don't think wearing a dress is comparable to abducting children or some shit. If it was all about self-expression, it wouldn't need surgeries or hormone influence. I'm pretty sure I've addressed this when I said not all trans people do these things to transition. But either way, that's a weak argument, refuted by mere existence of cosmetic surgery as a concept. Easy as usual. Then they make a lot of mistakes there as well. This is probably their strongest claim that they've made this entire debate, and it's still a really weak claim. The first one, and my favorite one, is it's pointless to debate something that is already widely seen as immoral and already illegal nationwide. Can anyone, just off the top of their head, think of something that might fall under this? I got you covered. Homosexuality, for the longest time in the United States, was both illegal and amoral. So therefore, by this person's logic, there's no point in debating whether or not homosexuality is a valid expression, because it was illegal and amoral at the same time, so therefore, we don't have to worry about it, because society has already decided. So why debate what's illegal and amoral, without ever questioning whether or not you personally think that's the case? I also pointed out that I directly said that CP and violent crime are not comparable in severity to transgenderism. I never once made the severity claim. The point was to show the slippery slope. So there's another straw man that they're making against me. One that is, of course, another fallacy. And then, of course, the other thing that I thought to be very funny was their very final line about it. That claiming cosmetic surgery refutes my claim that transitioning wouldn't be necessary. That's a ridiculous and bogus claim entirely. Because first of all, the very fact that some trans people will get surgery invalidates the notion that you can waive away the surgery claim because some of them do it. Enough of them do it that it's a major industry. Most trans people will go through hormonal or surgery changes, meaning that they think that they have to change something about their body to be a woman or a man, to affirm their delusion. When I double down on the claim that you shouldn't care if it doesn't impact you, I have to go back to the CP example. Somebody viewing CP has no impact on you whatsoever. Somebody illegally pirating CP, so they're not paying for it, they're not filming it. So let's say the most perfect example of a non-violent viewing of CP, which is of course still wrong, but doesn't cause any harm to anyone except maybe the person viewing it. It does not harm the child involved, it does not harm anybody filming it. All of that is easily ignored. Based on this person's reasoning that they are not concerned with what doesn't harm them specifically, they would have to say that viewing CP is fine, because it does not harm them directly if somebody else does that. I'm not defending CP, I'm pointing out that their argument is innately fallacious and weak. To which they think I am defending CP, and they actually at one point say, bro, I'm not going to debate pedophilia. I don't know what in your tiny fucking head makes you think I'm going to take you seriously when you frame it like that. I don't care to debate the morality of pedophilia, because anyone in their right mind already knows why it's wrong. They just invoked the self-evidency. They just invoked the idea that CP is wrong and pedophilia is wrong because it is self-evident, when they made a huge fit about me using self-evident as a claim earlier. Now that took a lot more time than I expected it to basically go through that argument, and as you can see, it's a very bad one. And the reason I wanted to show this is how almost every single debate with a TRA goes. They will do three things. They will plug their ears and pretend you didn't say something. They will come back at you with straw men and ad hominems, and then they will attack the very notion, calling you an unsympathetic person. They refuse to engage with debate. They refuse to engage in rhetoric. The idea here is, one, to dunk on these losers who think this is how you have a discussion, and two, to hope that maybe one day somebody will actually come out here and make a proper argument. Like I said, I've been watching a lot of content from the YouTuber King Critical, and I totally recommend everybody check him out because he does some amazing gender critical work. Now, I wouldn't consider myself gender critical because labels are for losers. But the point is, he does reactions to a lot of pro-trans videos. Most of what he does is watching a video and responding to it. And so this isn't just an experience from, say, people on Instagram, random people, but this is how people like PhilosophyTube argue. And all these other pro-trans or trans philosophy channels will argue in defense of their stance. They have no argument other than to attack the person, which is why they so heavily employ terms like TERF, or trans exclusionary, or transphobe, or even gender critical sometimes they'll invoke as an insult. And of course, the easy one, bigot. They have no argument, and they do not know how to deal with that, so instead they attack you, assuming you are in the same position as them, and then when you do make an argument, they have to find every single way to avoid and prevent themselves from answering said argument. But this took a lot longer than expected because this was a really long argument. And I admit, I run all my arguments through ChatGPT after the fact. So after I have the argument, I have ChatGPT analyze it to see where things could have gone wrong. And ChatGPT unanimously decided that I was the objective victor. Because unlike them, I actually provided points. I spoke using facts and logic. And I substantiated what I had to say when I needed to. And they just did nothing. If need be, I can paste this entire thing into comment or something so people can read the argument for themselves. But I removed the names for privacy, so it might be a little hard to follow along. And I hope you guys enjoyed just listening to me go through an argument, break it down some. I think I'm going to do this more in the future. If I have some really frustrating arguments, instead of covering pop culture or whatever else, I'll just cover the argument I'm having, and I'll explain it on a video so that people can then listen to it and see maybe where some problems lie. And the end goal is real simple. I want people to argue better. That's all I want. I want you to be able to make any argument so long as it is rooted in rhetoric. And that it goes for TRAs too. If TRAs suddenly started making good arguments, that would be a net positive. Because then we could actually meet them at the table and have actual discourse, actual debate, actual conversations, and try to find what's best for society. But when one side just plugs their ears, kicking their feet, and screaming, discourse can't happen. Decisions can't happen, and the world cannot move on or improve. So if you guys enjoyed this, my throat hurts. I've been talking too long, and I will see you guys on the next one.